What if we told you that the man who once ruled the world's biggest stages now wakes up each morning in silence? No cheers, no spotlight, not even music. Mick Jagger, the legendary face of rock, is now over 80. But what truly brought him down wasn't age. It was the wounds no one ever saw. Behind the dazzling lights were forgotten friendships, quiet betrayals behind the curtains, regrets never spoken, and a loneliness so deep not even his songs could touch it. Today his health slowly fades, and the long days pass in silence and shadow. This is not a story of glory and hope, but the slow decline of a fallen icon. And what you're about to hear is the truth the world was never meant to know. Let celebs rewind take you to the place where the spotlight fades and the silence finally begins to speak. Mick Jagger was not born into poverty or chaos. On the surface, his childhood seemed peaceful. A small little house on a quiet street in post-war Dartford, Kent, with loving yet strict parents and the steady, predictable rhythm of a country slowly healing from war. But beneath that calm surface was a quiet struggle, a growing unrest that slowly shaped the soul of a boy who would one day set the rock and roll world on fire. Mick Jagger was born on July 26, 1943, in Dartford, Kent, a peaceful town in southeast England. He was the oldest of two brothers. His younger brother, Chris Jagger, would later also pursue a career in music and film, but lived his whole life under the enormous shadow of his legendary older brother. Mick's father, Basil Fanshawe Jagger, a strict physical education teacher, believed in rules, order, and hard work. His mother, Eva Ensley Mary, a quiet hairdresser, valued tradition and simplicity, completely opposite to the wild and free world her young son secretly dreamed of. She was also a conservative party activist, deeply rooted in middle-class values, making Mick's future rebellion even more shocking to the family. At Wentworth Primary School, Mick was quiet but observant, always tapping his fingers to an invisible rhythm during class. It was at that very school where fate introduced him to another restless boy named Keith Richards. Their friendship would fade and be rekindled years later at Dartford train station, a meeting that would change music history forever. On that fateful day, Richards was holding a Chuck Berry record under his arm, which instantly caught Mick's attention. That shared love for American blues became the spark of a lifelong musical partnership. Within the quiet walls of that small house, Mick always felt like an outsider. The rooms were too quiet, the expectations too heavy, and his life too small for the fire quietly burning inside him. He craved color, sound, and excitement. But all he received was discipline, restraint, and endless reminders. Behave properly. Don't daydream. At every family gathering, when the other children sat quietly, Mick could not stay still. He danced, sang, and copied voices from the radio, desperately trying to break down the cold walls of order surrounding him. But no one truly listened. Behind those bright performances was a silent pain. A boy yearning to be seen, to be heard, to be understood. At school, his mixed energy made him different. Teachers frowned at his restlessness. Friends rarely understood his burning passion for music and rhythm. Even his parents dismissed his obsession with American blues records as childish nonsense. He treasured a worn-out Muddy Waters vinyl, spinning it late at night under his blanket with a flashlight like a sacred ritual only he understood. He also collected every Chuck Berry album he could get his hands on. Drawn to the raw honesty of blues music, Mick felt alone in his hunger for something greater beyond the gray streets and quiet afternoons of Dartford. At the age of 14, Mick could no longer bear the weight of that silence. Secretly, he slipped out at night, not to rebel, but to breathe. He snuck into a tiny club near town called the Railway Tavern just to feel the shaking floorboards under his feet as local musicians played. He borrowed worn microphones and sang with local bands in secret. "I wouldn't tell my parents what I was doing," he later admitted in an interview. That silent defiance, a child hiding his dreams from the people he loved most, was as heartbreaking as it was brave. Those stolen moments made him feel alive, a fleeting glimpse of the freedom he longed for. Yet they deepened his loneliness. No one knew the boy standing under the flickering lights of forgotten stages. When he returned home, there was no applause waiting, no warm smiles welcoming him, only cold walls and silent expectations. After completing his high school education, Mick enrolled at the prestigious London School of Economics, studying finance and accounting, a clear attempt to fulfill his parents' expectations. But his passion for music never faded. His reunion with Keith Richards at the Dartford train station reignited his dreams, and soon the Rolling Stones were born. That meeting wasn't just fate. It was the first domino in a story that would rewrite music history. His childhood was not stained by cruelty or poverty, but by something quieter, perhaps even more painful: the silent death of dreams within a house of rules. A voice born for the world, trapped in the silence of a small English town. And sometimes that is the deepest wound of all. Mick Jagger's journey into music wasn't a straight path. It was a battle between duty and desire, between the expectations of his family and the call of the stage. Before stepping on to the world's biggest stages, Mick had chosen a very different path. He enrolled at the prestigious London School of Economics, studying finance and accounting. It was a life designed by others, safe, respectable, and far from the wild rhythm beating in his soul. However, even while attending university, Mick secretly pursued music, sneaking off to perform at local clubs in the evenings. The deeper he went into that world, the more he realized he could not walk away from it. That detail, his quiet rebellion while studying at LSE, reveals so much about the man he was becoming. Torn between duty and an unquenchable thirst for artistic freedom, he was just a boy who didn't quite fit in. Too much rhythm in his blood, too much fire in his spirit. And though his parents wished for a quiet, respectable life, Mick's heart beat to a wilder tune. After reconnecting with Keith Richards at the Dartford train station, their shared love for American blues ignited something unstoppable. It was a moment so ordinary. Two boys on a platform, a record under one arm, yet it set history into motion. Along with Brian Jones, they formed the Rolling Stones, a name that would soon echo through stadiums, radios, and hearts across the world. But the beginning was far from glamorous. The band struggled to get gigs. Mick, still enrolled at the London School of Economics, juggled textbooks with late-night rehearsals. "We had maybe one gig a month," he once recalled. "We just couldn't get any work." It was a time of doubt, of second-guessing. But even in those quiet, hungry nights, he held on to the music. It was the only thing that made sense. Then, like a door opening in a dream, the Beatles offered a gift, a song called "I Want to Be Your Man." Released in 1963, it became the Rolling Stones' first hit. They didn't just play it, they transformed it, gave it edge, grit, soul, and width. That, the world began to take notice. From that spark came a fire. In 1971, fleeing Britain's crushing taxes, the band retreated to a crumbling villa in France to record "Exile on Main Street." The album was chaotic, sweaty, raw, and brilliant. It wasn't just music. It was rebellion bottled into sound. Today, it stands as one of rock's greatest achievements, and the hits kept coming. The Stones became the soundtrack of generations with songs like "I Can't Get No Satisfaction" 1965, "Paint It Black" 1966, "Sympathy for the Devil" 1968, "Gimme Shelter" 1969, "Brown Sugar" 1971, "Angie" 1973, and Start Me Up 1981. Albums like Sticky Fingers 1971, Some Girls 1978, Tattoo You 1981, and Blue and Lonesome 2016 weren't just records. They were revolutions. And as the noise softened and the lights dimmed, Mick explored another stage, not of music, but of cinema. Though best known for his musical genius, Mick Jagger also made his mark on the silver screen. As the roaring crowds eventually gave way to quieter years, Jagger explored film, not just as a side passion, but as another medium to express his complexity. His acting career, though selective, left a distinct impression through a handful of standout roles. His daring debut in performance, 1970, stunned audiences with its intensity and complexity. That same year, he portrayed the infamous Australian outlaw in Ned Kelly 1970. In Bent 1997, Jagger took on the poignant role of Greta, a cabaret performer in a World War II concentration camp, and perhaps his most acclaimed performance came in The Man. From Elysian Fields 2001, where he embodied Luther Fox, a smooth, layered character that revealed surprising emotional depth. These roles showcased another side of Mick, one not defined by guitars and stage lights, but by silence, expression, and the art of transformation. But behind the anthems, behind the swagger, was a man constantly pushing against time, pain, and public scrutiny. Each stage he stepped on was earned. Every note carried the weight of his defiance, his passion, and his refusal to disappear. With his wild snake-hip dancing, flamboyant outfits, and electrifying stage presence, Mick didn't just sing the music. He became it. He turned every performance into theater, every movement into a statement. He wasn't just the voice of the Stones. He was their beating, restless heart. Their massive world tours, including Steel Wheels 1989, 1990, Voodoo Lounge 1994, 1995, and A Bigger Bang 2005, 2007 broke records and silenced doubters. Even as critics questioned their longevity, the Stones answered not with words, but with sold-out arenas. In 2020, their re-release of Goat's Head Soup topped the UK charts, reminding the world that legends don't fade, they evolve. In 2023, they released Hackney Diamonds, their first studio album in 18 years. It was hailed as a return to form, raw, soulful, unfiltered. The album swept across international charts and won the 2025 Grammy for Best Rock Album. Their 2024 North American tour played to nearly 1 million fans, grossing over $235 million. And in 2025, while others his age settled into silence, Mick Jagger stepped back into the studio, completing 13 tracks for a new album set to be released in late 2025 or early 2026. When asked if he would ever stop, Mick simply smiled and said, "Why would I?" Because through it all, the chaos, the glory, the heartbreak, and the spotlight, that boy from Dartford never stopped dreaming. He kept singing, he kept running, he kept living. And in doing so, he didn't just become a rock star. He became a legend. The first great wound in Mick Jagger's life came in the summer of 1969, a year forever stained in the darkest corner of his heart. Brian Jones, not just a friend, but the co-founder of the Rolling Stones, was gone. Gone too soon. Gone forever. Only weeks earlier, Brian had been laughing with the band, his wild blonde hair catching the light, his guitar humming with restless energy. But behind that smile lay storms no one could calm. Battles with addiction, the law, and the growing distance between him and the group he helped create. His behavior had become increasingly erratic, and his health was visibly failing. Mick, torn between loyalty and responsibility, was forced to make a heartbreaking decision to ask Brian to leave the band he had helped build. It wasn't out of anger, but out of painful necessity, and then silence. One quiet night, they found him face down in his own swimming pool, his lifeless body floating under the cold moonlight. The world said accident. Some whispered darker theories, quiet suspicions that never found closure. But no answer ever truly came. Mick was shattered. For hours after the news, he sat alone by the edge of that pool, staring into the water that had stolen his friend. His eyes, usually burning with life and mischief, were hollow, distant. Somewhere in that silence, something broke inside him, because Brian's death wasn't just a loss. It was the first deep crack in a world Mick thought was unbreakable. A cruel reminder that talent, beauty, and dreams could all vanish overnight. For years after, Mick confessed he couldn't close his eyes without seeing Brian, young, laughing, full of promise. And then, in a blink, gone. That haunting image of Brian's pale body drifting beneath. The moon burned itself into Mick's memory, like a scar that would never fade. It was the moment he first understood the true cost of fame. The moment the golden glow of rock and roll turned for the first time to bitter, chilling shadow. This was not just the death of a friend. It was the death of innocence. The quiet, cruel end of the belief that the music, the joy, the brotherhood would last forever. And for Mick Jagger, nothing would ever feel safe again. Just a few days after the tragedy, the band stepped onto the stage at Hyde Park, not to celebrate, but to say goodbye. The concert, originally planned as the beginning of a new chapter for the Rolling Stones, suddenly turned into a public memorial for Brian Jones. Mick, fighting back tears, read a poem by Percy Bysshe Shelley in front of thousands of silent onlookers. And then, as if Brian's soul were being lifted into the summer light, dozens of white butterflies were released into the sky, their fragile wings catching the sun, carrying the memory of their fallen friend into the heavens. It was a moment the world would never forget. A farewell wrapped in poetry, sorrow, and gentle beauty. Altamont. The name alone echoes like a haunting melody in Mick Jagger's memory. A scar that never healed. It was supposed to be a celebration of peace, love, and music. A free concert in the winter of 1969 meant to unite a generation. But in a single irreversible moment, that dream collapsed and became a nightmare that still shadows Mick to this day. As the Rolling Stones played under the open sky, something unimaginable unfolded just feet from where Mick stood. An 18-year-old concertgoer named Meredith Hunter lost his life in a tragic incident involving one of the event's security personnel. A moment that stunned the crowd into frozen silence. The music stopped, sirens pierced the air, and Mick stood still, paralyzed by what he had just witnessed. That night didn't just end a concert. It ended an era, the summer of love that had defined. The 1960s seemed to vanish in an instant. The idea that music could always bring people together shattered. Every time Mick closed his eyes after that night, he could still see the flashing lights, the panicked crowd, and the heartbreaking image of a young man gone too soon. He later confessed, "Altamont took something from me, something I never got. Back, it changed him, it aged him, and it never left him." But the nightmare didn't end there. Years later, investigative reports revealed something deeply unsettling. The security team affiliated with a well-known motorcycle club reportedly held a lasting grudge toward Mick. They believed he had turned his back on them following the tragedy and the public backlash that followed. According to FBI records and a BBC radio investigation, there was even a moment when some members allegedly planned to confront Mick at his seaside home. The only thing that stopped them was a storm at sea. It wasn't just rumor, it was real. And it meant that from that point forward, Mick lived with a quiet, constant awareness that his safety might always be at risk. Every backstage entrance, every concert crowd, even the silence between songs became charged with uncertainty. Altamont didn't just take one life. It took something from everyone who was there, especially Mick. It stripped away the belief that art could always rise above chaos. It marked the end of innocence for an entire generation. Even decades later, Mick would find himself lying awake on tour in yet another hotel room, staring at the ceiling, wondering, what if I had stopped the show? What if we'd done things differently? No answer ever came. Altamont wasn't just a concert that went wrong. It was a turning point, a wound that time never closed. A moment when the music didn't heal and the dream simply faded away. But even before the heartbreaks, the betrayals, and the silences, there was a knock at the door. It was 1967, the height of the swinging 60s. The Rolling Stones were more than a band. They were a revolution in tight pants and louder-than-life anthems. But one cold February night, the dream was shattered at Keith Richards' countryside home. In Redlands, Mick and his inner circle had gathered for what was supposed to be a quiet escape. But unknown to them, betrayal had already crept in. A seemingly harmless chauffeur hired by Keith had tipped off the tabloid news of the world, claiming there would be a sex and drugs party. The story was sold. The police were waiting. What happened? Next became one of the most infamous moments in rock history. As the police stormed into the house, they didn't just find guitars and laughter. They found Marianne Faithfull, Mick's girlfriend, wrapped in nothing but a fur rug. They seized jackets, searched drawers, and in Mick's pocket, they found 4 tiny amphetamine pills. It should have been nothing. But to the British establishment, it was everything. Suddenly, the Stones weren't just musicians. They were criminals, threats to morality, corrupters of youth. Mick was arrested. So was Keith. So was their art dealer, Robert Fraser. But amid the chaos, something extraordinary happened. Marianne Faithfull confessed that the pills were hers. But Mick wouldn't let her take the fall. He stood silently in court and took the blame. He could have walked away free, but he didn't. It was an act of quiet courage. One journalist later wrote, he chose loyalty over self-preservation. In a world eager to crucify him, Mick protected the woman he loved. The tabloids exploded. The courts sharpened their knives. But just as it seemed the Stones would be sentenced, another voice rose to their defense. William Rees-Mogg, editor of the Times, a man no one expected to speak out, published an article titled, "Who Breaks a Butterfly on a Wheel?" He called the punishment cruel, disproportionate, unjust, and the country listened. Overnight, public opinion shifted. The charges softened. The Stones walked free. But they were never the same. Behind the swagger, behind the sunglasses, something had broken. The message was clear. We don't just want your music. We want your silence. And for Mick, that night at Redlands wasn't just an arrest. It was the moment the world showed him how quickly it could turn. And just as the darkness of arrests and trials began to dim, a new, deeper wound opened, one that stripped Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones of their very roots. By 1971, frustration with the British Labour government had reached a boiling point. A crushing 93% tax rate, compounded by a bitter breakup with manager Alan Klein that drained the band's finances, left them facing a future stripped of stability and creative freedom. It was a moment so cold, so merciless, that it left them with no choice but to say goodbye to their homeland. Devastated but resolute, Mick, Keith, Charlie, Bill, and Mick Taylor left the familiar streets of England behind and sought refuge under the Mediterranean sun. In the sun-drenched town of Villefranche-sur-Mer, nestled on the French Riviera, they found temporary solace in a crumbling seaside mansion called Nelgate. There in the villa's dark, damp basement, they built a makeshift life in exile. It was cramped, it was chaotic, but it was also defiant. This wasn't just a logistical move. It was a protest, a declaration. We will not be silenced. Recording Exile on Main Street wasn't a luxury. It was survival. Amid swirling drugs, creative, tension, and the ever-present ache of displacement. Their basement sessions poured raw emotion and rebellion into every track. The album's jagged edges and soulful grit mirrored their fractured reality. Unpolished, unstable, yet unapologetically alive. Even when abandoned by their own government, they never lost their essence. On the contrary, they asserted their artistic freedom more boldly than ever before. Despite the turmoil, the Stones didn't collapse, they transformed. Exile on Main Street became one of their most iconic works, hailed not just for its music, but for its spirit of resistance. As Keith Richards would later say, it felt like we were being pushed out of our own country. But rather than fold, they thrived abroad, turning pain into poetry, exile into art. Heartbreakingly, even in this turbulent chapter, joy came, but always wrapped in distance. In May 1971, amid the chaos and creative fire, Mick married Bianca Perez Mora Macias in a lavish sunlit ceremony in St. Tropez. It was no ordinary wedding. It was a spectacle. Celebrities, fashion royalty, and music elites gathered under the Riviera sun, turning the day into a surreal blend of rock and high society. Cameras flashed, champagne flowed, and for a brief, dazzling instant, it looked like happiness had finally found Mick. The wedding made headlines around the world, not just for its extravagance, but for its symbolism. Glamorous guests from the worlds of music, fashion, and high society poured into St. Tropez, turning the quiet town into a temporary capital of rock royalty. Friends described Mick as glowing, yet others saw a flicker of distance in his eyes. How sad it was, the look of a man carrying the weight of exile, even on the happiest day of his life. Some whispered, perhaps cruelly, that the grandeur was a distraction, a way to reclaim control amidst personal and political chaos. So cruel, even love had to bloom on borrowed soil. It was a toast to love, yes, but also to survival. A moment of light against a backdrop of uncertainty. In that moment, surrounded by glitz and applause, Mick wore both triumph and sorrow in his eyes. The wedding wasn't just about romance. It was an act of defiance, a way of reclaiming something personal and pure amid all that exile had stolen. It was a fleeting spark in a storm, brilliant, rare, and gone too soon. In the 1980s, while the Rolling Stones were conquering the world, filling stadiums, topping charts, and basking in global adoration, something fragile was tragically crumbling. Behind the curtain, fame, it seemed, had come at a price far greater than any of them had expected. At the center of it all was Mick Jagger. With his star rising higher than ever, and whispers of a solo career swirling, tensions began to simmer between him and his longtime bandmates. Keith Richards, in his brutally honest memoir, Life, recounted a moment that would forever redefine their bond. It wasn't during a concert or recording session, but in a quiet hotel hallway in Amsterdam in 1984. Mick had called Charlie Watts, the band's quiet and elegant drummer, at a disrespectful hour and demanded, "Where's my drummer?" It was a small sentence, arrogant, perhaps even cruel, but to Charlie it was a deep wound, a betrayal of brotherhood. Dressed not in rock attire, but a perfectly tailored Savile Row suit, Watts stormed into Mick's room. His voice, normally calm and measured, shook with fury. "Don't ever call me your drummer again," he said. Then came the unthinkable. Watts, the calmest of them all, threw a punch that sent Jagger staggering backward toward an open window and a canal below. It was Keith Richards who grabbed him just in time, pulling his bandmate back from the brink. In that heartbreaking split second, the Rolling Stones were no longer rock gods. They were just men, flawed, tired, and on the edge of losing each other. This wasn't just a fight. It was the collapse of something sacred. For decades, the Rolling Stones had been a fortress of camaraderie. But success had created distance. Ego had created silence. And in that silence, the ache of unresolved tension quietly festered. Though the band continued on producing hits, touring the globe, making history, the dynamic had shifted. The laughter wasn't quite the same. The glances on stage had changed. Mick Jagger would go on to achieve great things as a solo artist. But that night in Amsterdam would linger as a tragic reminder that even legends, no matter how untouchable they seem, are still vulnerable to the pain of pride, the cost of ambition, and the bitter silence that comes when brotherhood breaks. It was no longer about money or fame. This time, the blow was straight to the heart. Just as the public scrutiny began to ease, a quieter, far more painful grief crept in. In December 1985, Mick Jagger suffered a devastating loss: the sudden death of Ian Stewart, the band's founding pianist, an unsung hero from a heart attack. Mick didn't cry in public, but something in his eyes shifted forever. Those sharp, defiant eyes now looked hollowed by heartbreak. Ian wasn't flashy. He didn't chase fame or headlines. But he was the first person who ever believed in Mick before. The stardom before the scandals. He was the quiet pillar of the Rolling Stones, often called the glue that held us together. And when that glue vanished, the silence that followed was deafening. From that day forward, every recording studio felt colder to Mick. Every rehearsal room echoed with absence. It was like stepping into a house with one wall missing. Something essential had collapsed. In interviews, Mick said little, but his words carried weight. Ian was family. He was the compass. And now that compass was gone. The band felt the shift. Without Ian's steady hand and calming presence, tension often filled the void he left. Mick once described him as the man who kept the chaos from spiraling. And now the chaos had no counterbalance. The loss wasn't just personal. It shook the band's emotional foundation. That quiet man, the man who had always stayed in the shadows, never asking for the spotlight, became the one whose absence left the biggest shadow. His death was not just another chapter. It was a turning point, another ghost, another scar. On stage, Mick tried to keep the show alive, but those who looked closely could see it. The subtle stiffness, the glance toward the piano that no longer echoed back. Stewart's legacy lived not in solos, but in the spaces he once filled with calm, humor, and strength. So cruel, even as the band soared higher, Mick's world grew emptier. The cost of longevity wasn't just age. It was outliving the people who built your beginning. This wasn't about fame. It wasn't about fortune. This was grief. Pure, quiet, and crushing. For Mick Jagger, the silence after Ian Stewart's passing was louder than any crowd he'd ever faced, and fate wasn't finished with him yet. After the heartbreaking loss of Ian Stewart, the co-founder of the Rolling Stones, and one of the few who truly understood and supported Mick from the beginning, the cracks in his personal life seemed to deepen. It was a time when his career and soul began to drift apart, and Mick slowly slipped into a string of incomplete relationships. It is truly heartbreaking when those closest to him drifted away, leaving behind voids that nothing could fill. Despite his irresistible allure and ageless charm, Mick Jagger never held on to lasting love. His first child, Carrie's, was born from a relationship with singer Marsha Hunt before he was ever married. Initially unacknowledged, Mick later accepted financial responsibility for Carrie's. Yet the bond between father and daughter was never truly close. Carrie's grew up without her father's presence, bearing silent scars that Mick perhaps never fully grasped. It is truly sorrowful that Carrie's, his very first child, had to validate her own existence in a courtroom. When love is not recognized, A child loses not only a father, but the right to be loved as they deserve. His only legal marriage was to Nicaraguan model Bianca Perez Mora Macias, a high-profile union that took place in 1971 in Saint-Tropez, surrounded by glamour and applause. But behind the beautiful facade were growing fractures. Betrayals, public scandals, and emotional distance led Bianca to leave, taking with her their daughter Jade and a wounded heart. Jade, the daughter born from that lone marriage, once tried to preserve the father-daughter bond, but the chaos of fame and diverging paths pushed her further away from her father. There are silences in a family that no rare meeting can ever truly fill. Years later, Jerry Hall entered Mick's life and became his longest-standing companion. They were together for nearly 2 decades and had 4 children: Elizabeth, James, Georgia May, and Gabriel. Many believed she would be his final great love. James, the son who inherited his father's musical dream, confessed that he had to fight to be seen as himself, not just Mick Jagger's son. Even under the same roof, James felt his father was more of a distant icon than a close parent. James, who shared his father's musical passion, grew up feeling consumed by the weight of the Jagger name. He didn't want to be a replica, but his father rarely saw that. Sadly, this reflected a broader truth. Mick was often present in image, but absent in emotion. In 1999, Jerry filed for divorce after years of tolerating infidelities, culminating in the revelation that Mick had fathered a child with Brazilian model Luciana Morad. That child, Lucas Jagger, was born the same year, pushing the relationship beyond repair. Lucas grew up with his mother, far from his father. Though they eventually became closer, the loneliness of his childhood left indelible marks. Lucas was raised half a world away from Mick, where every mention of his father's name was met with quiet questions. Where is my father? Why does everyone else know him, but I do not? Though Mick denied the legality of their 1990 Bali wedding, he continued to provide financial support and tried to maintain bonds with his children, a responsibility he never rejected. After Hall, Mick remained deeply connected to LWREN Scott, a woman who was not just a longtime partner of 13 years, but also a quiet anchor in his chaotic world. When she passed away in her Manhattan apartment, no words could express the shock. That heartbreaking morning, when the call came, Mick collapsed in his hotel room in Australia, paralyzed by shock, devastated beyond words. Doctors diagnosed him with acute stress disorder, and the Rolling Stones canceled their entire tour. Spotlight dimmed. The music stopped. Mick later admitted, "I just couldn't believe it. I didn't realize how much pain she was in." In the unbearably painful days that followed, he sat alone in her apartment, frozen in time. He couldn't bring himself to move a single object, as if disturbing her things would erase what little presence remained. There were no headlines that could capture the silence in that room, no lyric that could express what had been lost. Her laughter, once the music that filled their home, was replaced by a silence that rang louder than any song. A part of me died with her, he confessed. From that moment on, something in Mick changed. The world still saw the icon, the performer, but inside he carried a grief that would never quite let go. A silent sorrow, a song he could never finish. In 2016, at the age of 73, Mick welcomed his youngest son, Devereaux Octavian Basil Jagger, with ballet dancer Melanie Hamrick, who is 44 years his junior. Their relationship began not long after the tragic passing of LWREN Scott, a somber echo of a wound not yet healed. Despite the vast age difference, they remained quietly close, rarely appearing in public. Devereaux's arrival was more than a surprise late in life. It was a quiet punctuation mark in Jagger's stormy, romantic journey. Mick has a total of 8 children with 5 different women. And though he has claimed to love them all, many grew up in separation. Some had no father figure. Some lived under the shadow of a legend. And some, like James, Carries, or Lucas, carried unanswered questions in their hearts. Was my father's love ever real or just a myth? It feels cruel that a man could stand on stage for decades and still lose his way in his own home. Rumors of over 4,000 relationships, as noted by biographer Christopher Anderson, only added to the image of a man forever chasing conquest. But what did that chase leave behind, if not heartbreak, indifference, and distance? Lovers came and went, from Madonna and Angelina Jolie to Carla Bruni, but few ever stayed. And when even his longest relationship with Jerry Hall couldn't withstand the cracks, Mick faced a bitter truth. That for him, love was always fragile and fleeting. Much like the electric pace he lived his life by, he built an empire on constant motion, touring, changing, reinventing. But as age and loss began to knock on his door, what remained were only echoes from relationships never whole, children never close enough, and emotions never strong enough to hold on to. In the end, what remains in his life are not the names of his lovers, but the distance he never managed to bridge with those he once loved most. After all the failed loves, the wordless goodbyes of broken marriages, and the aching distance,